So on Syria, as Frank said, our allies in this fight, the rebels, the al-Nusra and the Islamic state of Iraq and Levant, as they call themselves, and others, many other Islamists, not only have put the Christians in the middle of a sectarian civil war within Islam, but they are waging a shadow war against the Christians. Again, their goal, one of their end games is to purify the land for Islam. They do not want any non-Muslims there. And so they're using this opportunity to attack them. Just this last week, there have been horrific developments inside one of the Christian heritage sites on UNESCO's list in Malula, right north of Damascus. That is a beautiful town built into a mountainside. The population there, it's a Christian town. It's about 3,000 to 4,000 people. They speak the language of Jesus of Nazareth, Aramaic. So the rebels took a position higher up in the mountain, shelled it for several days, then entered the town. I received word from my contacts inside Syria saying that 30 people have disappeared from the town. They've been taken away. There were 3 young men that were killed by the rebels again, and they were forced to convert. There was at least some of them were forced to convert to Islam, and one woman's husband refused, and she related that his throat was slit then. There are several monasteries there, including one where most of the population has since fled, but there's a group of nuns, 24 nuns there, Orthodox nuns, with several dozen orphans in their monastery, and they're holed up in caves or catacombs that the early Christians used. The Syrian army, the government's army, came and flushed the rebels out of Malula just a couple days ago, and the Christians there definitely saw that as a rescue operation. Again, the Obama administration has said virtually nothing about the Christians in Syria and the plight of the Christians. And so what can be done? Well, right now we're trying to identify humanitarian aid agencies that can take food into these Christian villages that are isolated. One of the issues is that the Christians are afraid to go into UN camps when they flee the country and go into Lebanon or go into Turkey. They're afraid to go in the UNHCR camps because these camps are overrun by Sunni militants, the people that they're trying to escape, and the young men are dragooned into fighting for these Sunni militias. So they go to churches and monasteries and schools run by the church that have been there for 2,000 years in Lebanon and Turkey. And as a consequence, they do not get the aid we provide, and they are not on any roster of list of possible refugees coming to the United States. So there's discussions now about bringing many thousands of refugees here from Syria that the UN recommends, but none of the Christians will be on it because they are not registering with the UN. So that's a big problem, and we want to flag that. Egypt, we should be talking about reconstruction aid for their churches. And the United States does reconstruction of mosques around the world, in Iraq and other places. We build mosques, actually in, I think it was in Ethiopia we were building mosques through a Pentagon program. We should be reconstructing.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, Ethiopia is a Christian country, majority Christian, but nevertheless, somebody had the bright idea that if we built them, maybe the Salafis wouldn't or Saudi Arabia wouldn't. And then we need, really a grand strategy. I mean, Chris Smith had a piece today in the Washington Post about, well, let's have an international criminal court, a special criminal court set up to try Assad and the rebels who are committing war crimes. That's a good idea. I support that. But we really need a grand strategy. That's just one step. And the destruction of the chemical weapons, if it ever happens, is just one step. We really need a strategy to figure out how to preserve the minorities. The Christians have been registered and recognized by the Alawite government because they're also a minority, and the Alawites have looked to find alliances where they can, and that they there's some interesting details that I won't get into, but about why the Alawites aligned themselves with Iran in the first place. And basically, it was stemmed on their experience during the centuries of the Ottoman Empire, and that they are a minority and wanted to ensure their own survival. That points to some possible solutions to assure that there aren't these retribution killings. So there was David Ignatius wrote about it in his column this week about a strategy plan presented by the Syrian Free Army, that's the rebels that we're aligned with, to the State Department. And there was no real consideration in it of any reprisal killings against any group. And instead, the chief strategist for the Free Syrian Army assured the State Department that there wouldn't be any reprisals against the regime, that they'd be put on trial, and everything would be done according to justice. There was no mention in the plan, as far as I could tell, or even in Ignatius' column, about the Christians. You know, the other things that we have to really work on better, since the press is not doing their job, is demanding that that the press start reporting on issues like who are the Islamist figures in Egypt and what is their track record? Which spiritual advisors do they follow? What are the fatwas saying? There's many myths about the Muslim Brotherhood, that they were Democrats. They're not Democrats. They're majoritarianists. They are not liberal. They believe in a pre-modern power system. Islamism is dead is another myth in Egypt. Islamism isn't dead. The Muslim Brotherhood has been dealt a very serious blow, but there are many Salafi groups that are part of the government, are being brought into the constitution drafting process that's now underway, and who will be running in elections for the parliament. We have to be very careful about this new development. Or development, it's not new. The Salafis, of course, won a quarter of the parliament in the last round of elections about a year ago. They're probably even stronger now, because the culture itself is Islamist. And that has been deepening in recent years. And we need to have a midterm or long-term solution to that. We should be working on education and sending, translating works into Arabic, modern Arabic, that the Egyptians can understand about the founding fathers here or other liberal philosophers, and modern ideas. You know, my last word on this, I want you to consider the importance of this Christian population to the Middle East. They are the largest minority in the Middle East. There are more Copts in Egypt, for example, than there are Jews in Israel. All the other non-Muslim religious minorities, I'm not talking about the Kurds, because they're also Muslim background, but the non-Muslim religious minorities are even more vulnerable. And you know, for example, the Mandeans are they're followers of John the Baptist. They're also in Damascus and writing to me, saying that they're in terrible, dire peril as well. But it's going to be very difficult for any of these minorities to survive in a totally Islamicized Middle East. The Christians and the other minorities, like over time, the Zoroastrians, the Jews, and by the way, there are hardly, I think you know this, hardly any Jews left in either Syria or Egypt. I think there's a handful in both places, if that. But these minorities have had an outsized influence on the culture in these societies. The first modern school, a school that really taught science, literature, foreign languages, math, was, you know, not a madrasa, but a modern Western education school, was a Coptic school. The first in Egypt, the first school was a Coptic school. The first school to educate girls in Egypt was a Coptic school. So they've made enormous contributions to the society, being moderators, mediators with the West, and it'll be a tremendous loss. I think it'll be a geopolitical issue as the demographics change, and it is a national security issue. So thank you very much.
Nina, thank you. Let me ask one question, if I may, multi-part, I guess, really. It's staggering that the administration has not said anything about this. It's just staggering, other than the part of a sentence. Similarly, it seems that your former commission is not much in evidence at the moment either, are they? And lastly, the other part of this is, on this bit about refugees, I have been told that we have essentially contracted out the responsibility for defining who qualifies as a refugee to the United Nations, which is essentially, as you know, now a project of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Would you talk a little bit about that as kind of the backdrop to this that is perhaps contributing to not just our blindness to this problem, but that of much of the rest of the world as well?
Yeah, that's right. The Islamists have gotten control of these offices in the Middle East of the UNHCR. In fact, the UN relies on them to be their local staff. I was in Saudi Arabia 2 years ago as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and met a Saudi guy who had actually converted to Christianity, and he converted while he was a student in Lebanon, and he went to the UN, he told me, for asylum. They denied it, and he was escorted onto a plane back to Riyadh, where he was met by military and immediately imprisoned, and spent the next several years in prison and would have been killed if his family didn't have connections and get him out. But that's a perfect example of what goes on. The Christians know this. This is widely known in that region, and they tell each other, don't go to the UN, avoid the UN at all costs, because they are infiltrated by Islamists who mean to do them harm and can report them, report on their families, too, back inside Syria. I spoke with a Christian couple from Syria this week, and they were so terrified. They were in my office. They were going back to Syria. They were church figures. They were so terrified they would not tell me their names, and they did not even want to tell me. They didn't want to tell me what they did or where they were from within Syria, although I know it was in the Damascus area. There was a Christian reporter with me, and I said, can you, in my office, I said, do you mind if he stays? And just for background, they said, no, he has to go. We're just too afraid. These are leaders, and they are terrified of reprisals. There is reprisal killings going on now, much less, never mind what happens after the rebels win, if they win. We have a situation there where our friends the Saudis have brought in, and Turkey is allowing over its border many, many jihadists. In fact, the Christians, the Christian Solidarity International is another group that has gone to Jordan and interviewed Christians there. And they took testimony from Christians saying that they heard these jihadis speaking. They were not speaking with accents that were local. They were coming from many countries, including Indonesia and all over the world. They found it unbelievable, but they also found it unbelievable because some of these young jihadis were telling them that they were told that they were going to Israel and that they were actually fighting in Israel. Others told them that they were, this was the first step to Jerusalem, that they came because, they asked, why are you come to Syria, from Indonesia or somebody, and the answer was, this is the first step to Jerusalem. So this is a very dangerous situation, and we should be, in our grand strategy, thinking about right now about how to tackle that.
Has the Commission been silent?
Well, the Commission did issue a report on Syria in, I think, June or April, about the different minority makeup and how what a perilous situation it is for them. So they did raise the flag on that, and they issued a statement when Egypt was being attacked. But the Egypt church story was a one-day story. It's devastating to this church what has happened to them in August and what is continuing to happen to them. And the Egyptian military has promised to, Sisi has promised to rebuild the churches. We should hold them to that. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but we should hold them to that. There is a precedent where they did rebuild a church about a year ago when it was burned. And we should provide some money for it, frankly, and take it out of the military funding. But the decibel, no doubt about it, the decibel level has to be raised on this.
Dan.
The military regime in Egypt is doing some good things in Sinai, but I'm troubled by their actions relative to Christians. I wanted to know if you could give me kind of the inside story. One hears that they are allowing, for essentially political purposes, I guess, to increase their popularity with the population, the attacks on Christians to take place, and the Christians are really being squeezed both by the Islamists on the one hand and by the inaction, kind of non-benign inaction by the government. Is that your understanding? Is that propaganda?
I think that's part of the answer, and part of it is a conscript army. I have a brilliant Coptic analyst who works with me from Egypt. His name is Samuel Tadros. You may have seen his works in the Wall Street Journal and Fox News, and he has a new book out called Motherland Lost about the modernization of the Coptic Church and the struggle for modernity in Egypt. But he tells me that it's a conscript army, and the fact is because the culture is so Islamicized that those troops are sympathetic to the Salafist mobs. So that's also what we're dealing with. And that's what I said. We need a long-term grand strategy to de-radicalize and de-Islamicize. Yeah, I don't think there's any orders to attack the Christians, but I think that they step aside or they don't respond. There's church after church figure attesting how he was calling for the police. The police were a block away. The station's a block away, or the military was outside the gates, and they never responded, or the fire engine never came to put out the fire. There was definitely on the local level a reluctance to get involved. And, we heard reports, we have testimony from Christian farmers in Syria where they are also being squeezed, as you said. And it was a perfect example of what you just described. Some tribe came and occupied their farm. And so this family who'd been there for thousands of years went to the police, whom they were friendly with, and it was, Assad's government, and said, can you eject them? There's, squatting and taking over my farm. And they said, sorry, we can't help you because we can't, it's a large tribe and we can't afford to alienate them. We need all the friends we can get right now.
Adam?
Syria, which you just started talking about, do the Christians have any militias there? I've been told that there's an Assyrian Christian militia in the Kurdish area. And how are they treated in, let's say, the Kurdish area or areas where they might actually be in the majority?
I don't know that much about the Kurdish area. So that's the first time I've heard that there's a Christian militia there. It's its own militia. Okay. I've had there have been some local defense committees, like neighborhood watch committees in Christian villages. But there's outside what you just said, I have not heard of any militias. The church is mixed on, well, the church is against it because they feel like there's not enough Christians to, it's 10% of the population. And by the way, about a quarter of them have fled or displaced. The church is saying something like 450,000 Christians have already left their homes in the last year. So that's a quarter of the population. and that so that they're not going to be able to defend themselves even with guns, and it'll just make it worse. At least they have some sense that the Alawites, some expectation that the Alawite army would protect them.
Anybody else?
Now that James Ogby is the latest member of the Commission on Religious Freedom, recently appointed, the direction doesn't seem to be good in terms of the next 3 years of this administration actually leaving what, at least on the surface, appears to be not just a neutral but an anti-Christian position here. What can be done to reach out to denominations in America to do, and what are the options for private sector initiatives here, either organizationally to create a new institution to deal with refugees, if the UN has failed, either in a private-public partnership or some other way, or simply to conduct private relief efforts, or to get the message out, because there's a huge Christian media that can go around the mainstream media here.
Yeah, I've been working with the Christian media, and that has been very helpful. I've been looking into humanitarian efforts, and it looks like Catholic Relief Services is helping out on the ground inside Syria as well as outside. The International Rescue Committee is also sending food kits to Christian villages. I've been told by the Christian political representatives inside Syria. Unfortunately, World Vision is been chased out by Hezbollah. Hezbollah, has threatened to kill expats. So, because they don't work with locals, they had to leave Lebanon, Turkey, and now World Vision, I think, is, and that's off the record. By the way, that's off the record. But it is this is a part of the warning that the U.S. government has made to non-essential personnel in its embassies in southeastern Turkey and in Lebanon. I think it was about 2 weeks ago or so when Hezbollah was threatening to do us harm, and so all the expats who are there have had to flee. So it's made it extremely difficult. And some aid agencies are very active in Jordan, which is nice, doing schools and whatnot. But I don't think there are many Christians. There's some, but there are not many Christians going to Jordan. So we really need to be focusing and working with the churches and the local villages, I guess, in Turkey and in particularly in Lebanon, which has taken, I think, the most per capita refugees, or absolute numbers of refugees from Syria. And there's an Orthodox charity too. So I'm trying to track that down now. I'm going to London next week to further that. I've heard that the UK, instead of, now that it's not doing the military component, it's redirecting its efforts for humanitarian. And Sweden and Germany have taken large numbers of Syrian refugees, including Christians. There's an entire town now in Sweden that is teaching in Assyrian in the schools, which is the Christian ethnic group.
They've also been taking a lot of Muslims, I believe.
Yes, they've been taking a lot of Syrians, period.
Could you just take 1 more minute, please, and speak about Iraq and what has happened to Christians in that community? Yeah,
this is very much on the mind of the Syrians, in particular the Syrian Christians, and that is that in the last 10 years, 2/3 of the Christians in Iraq have been driven out, and they've been driven out through terror. And again, this was a part of a blindness on the part of our government as well. It's not our government's fault, but I know this one incident there was a mixed Christian pluralistic neighborhood in Baghdad called Dora neighborhood, and there were many thousands of Christians living there. And in 2006, Salafis moved into the local mosque and sent all the Christian families death threats. One of the families was Donnie George, who was the head of the Baghdad Museum. He was the one that raised the flag about the looting of the Baghdad Museum. He got his son, adult son lived with him, personally got a letter with a bullet in it saying, you've got to convert or leave immediately or you're going to be killed. So Donnie Georgian's family fled, as did thousands of others from Dora neighborhood. It was erased of its ancient Christian population overnight. We had over 100,000 troops in Baghdad and Iraq at the time. It was during the height of the surge. And there was no directive, there was no policy. I was going around, others were going around, the commission was going around talking about the situation, Federalist Society and so forth, and there was just no response. The machine of state, the ship of state, was too big to turn around, and no one was ordered to protect these Christians, to evict the Salafis in the mosque who were doing this and wreaking havoc on this neighborhood. So that's just one little example, but the other example that was horrible from Iraq, and it's a lesson to be learned here in Syria, is that when the United States started rebuilding Iraq, sending in billions in reconstruction aid, it used the old Saddam Hussein power structures and gave that aid to Shiite Sunnis and Kurds. There were Christian villages in Nineveh Plain that did not get any of it. They were not hooked up to the power grids. The governance of these other religions withheld it from them deliberately, and it was not viable. So the essentials of life were withheld from their villages, and they did not get schools, roads, water, or electricity, so they abandoned the villages and they fled. So we must keep that in mind when we start giving out aid within Syria.
Amen.